Jane, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. When you emailed your story in, it was so great, and we're so excited to have you on. And my daughter's name is Jane, which is really special. So you don't see that too often anymore, but
I should
it,
name, but it's coming back a little bit.
it is. Yeah, yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about you, just kind of, a little background so listeners have some context before we jump into your story. Like maybe a little bit about where you live, your family.
Well, I'm living in the Utah Valley, about an hour and a half south of Salt Lake, a little town called Santa Quin, with my older sister. When I first came here 2.5 years ago, we were both living with our other sister who lives a mile and a half away. And I had one little room, 10 by 10 room, and I had sold all my house and all my possessions after my husband died and after COVID was over, because I had to wait a year to take a road trip. Less than a year ago, about 9 months ago, my older sister Lynn and I decided to buy our own house, and we found this wonderful 3-story townhouse, and we love it. We're happy, and it's certainly keeping our legs strong.
I love it. That is so awesome. I love to hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump into your story.
Okay. Well, I think I'm probably, as far as I've ever heard, the longest away from the church to come back, because I was converted at 13, almost 13, when my widowed mother married a member of the church, and we all joined the church. And then when I went to BYU, I had a really strong independent streak. I was a closet rebel, and I stepped away from the church due to various things that happened that shouldn't have happened. But because I had not nurtured my testimony, I did not feel guilty about those things. And so one day when I was thinking, is God even there? Is the church true? Or is it all just a bunch of phony baloney? And so I got down on my knees in our apartment living room and I prayed to know. I said, God, are you really there? And if you are, is this church true? Well, I didn't hear anything. I said, okay, that's my answer. And when I stood up, the campus carillon bell started playing a hymn. I don't remember which one, but I know it was familiar to me, and the words of that hymn were supposed to be my answer. But I said, nah, that's just a coincidence. So at 19, I just was gone. I was out of the church. When I was still a senior in high school, I went up to BYU to visit my older sister Lynn, who was at BYU, and her boyfriend's roommate was the man that I met. I'm going to call him John. So John and I started corresponding for a little while, and then that dropped off. And funny story, during my freshman year at BYU, I walked into a voting booth because it was school elections, and I saw this note, John Smith for class clown. Now, he was a kidder, but he was very bold. He ran for office, and then I thought, wow, that's a sign to me. So I started writing to him again, and he was in the Army basic training. And in other words, we connected over letters, and in his letters, he was very idealistic. He wanted to become a lawyer to stop segregation. He was from Shreveport, Louisiana, where there was, even years after the laws were passed, he still saw a lot of segregation. We connected through writing, and long story short, in my junior year, when I was home for Christmas, he came out. He drove out from his basic training, and we met and we connected, and we said, well, he was on his way to Vietnam. He was leaving in about 3 months. And we said, well, we kind of think we might love each other, but he said we should still date other people. And if we feel the same way about each other when he got back from Vietnam, then maybe we would get married. So I had another boyfriend at school, and I told him I did. So he left, and then he called when I was out with my other boyfriend, because he said, we still see other people. So I took him at his word, and it was probably a little miffed that he didn't love me enough to commit. So he called one night when I was out on a date, and he couldn't take it. He sent me a pawn shop engagement ring with a little tiny diamond. And then I left school and flew home to San Diego, and then flew to Shreveport to meet his parents, and then flew to North Carolina where he was stationed. And we got married in a base chapel. The stained glass window over the door was paratroopers. And I could swear that the chaplain was wearing army boots, but I could be just making that up. And when we came out of the ceremony, I didn't know any of the people. There were 6 people there. I didn't know any of them. And when we went into the rec room where they were set up a tiny little reception for us, the punch bowl had broken, and there were a couple of grunts swabbing the floor. And then we ran out the door in a shower of rice, and I got into his old Volkswagen Beetle. The lace on my thrift shop wedding dress was all shredded. At the time, I just laughed, but looking back, I thought, those were omens. You should have paid attention to those. But I didn't. I was in love with this idealistic man. And then when he got out of the army, he went to law school. And I know it doesn't happen to everybody, but it started changing the way he thinks, the way he thought. And he started getting very confrontational. He loved to fight anyway. And he would, pick at me for something. And then when I had a screaming fit, he would call me a fishwife. And so, that sort of over years started killing my love. And although he had a lot of good qualities, he was a good man, but he had his own demons. I had my demons because one thing I skipped over, which I should not because it defined my whole life, was that my father died in a plane crash when I was almost 9 years
Oh,
old.
wow.
My
Oh my
mother had four
gosh.
children. They had three girls and then a boy. And then my father in 1953 got a vasectomy because we found out after my mother died that she never really wanted to have children. And that explained a lot about my mother. And so after my father died, she went into a tailspin. She was emotionally unavailable to us for most of our childhood and the rest of our life. And she admitted once when I visited her, and she had gone back to Texas with her youngest son, who was a paranoid schizophrenic. She said, "Well, I think, Jane, you raised yourself." I said, "Yeah, I know I did." And she said, "I think you did a pretty darn good job." I said, "Well, thanks, Mom." But, the absence of our father and the emotional absence of our mother tainted all our lives. And we all dealt with it in our own separate ways because he died in 1956. We were really, truly not allowed to grieve. After my mother first told us what the telegram said, that he was missing, presumed dead, but it was a small plane, the same bomber he flew in World War II, and it crashed into a mountainside in Scotland. And my dad was the pilot, and he and the navigator died instantly.
Oh
But
my
after that,
gosh.
my mother didn't even let us see her cry because our grandmother said, "Don't cry in front of the children." And that was such a huge mistake. If anybody out there is saying they should not expose children to grief, children have to be exposed to that grief because they don't know how to deal with it. If they don't deal with it, then, and it festers and it grows. And it took me until I was well into my 30s to begin really dealing with that loss of my beloved father because he was a wonderful dad. He was amazing. I got my driver's license in Louisiana. I was only 20 when we married. And I got my driver's license and I loved being out on the road in that car by myself with nobody trying to tell me what to do. I became so independent because my parents were basically gone. We had a stepfather and he was a good man, but he didn't quite know how to be a father to these teenage girls. But I became very insular, always up in my room reading the book and wishing I could disappear into the pages of that book with a happy ending. So I was depressed. I was angry. I was rebellious quietly. My mom always said I was passive aggressive, and I was because I didn't let it show, but I was a rebel at heart. And that was at the crux of my leaving the church because I didn't even want God telling me what to do. So that colored my whole life. And after I left John, I went to New York City because I had already met someone there. I was already at least half in love with the man that I met there, David. He handled our divorce, and I was very happy. David and I were extremely happy together. We were together for 44 years, and we didn't even get married for the first 20 because I was out of the church. And when I first went to New York, I was like in the whole 70s thing.
Mm-hmm.
60s, 70s were really what they call the 60s. That was actually the 70s. And there was sex, drugs, rock and roll, the disco scene, bopping around to bars, drinking too much, and really having fun. But let me tell you something, a hangover is not fun.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
stuff is just, the people who think that's fun, it feels fun while you're doing it. But in retrospect, it's just trying to fill the hours of the day and have some raucous fun and, dancing to disco. But anyway, David and I were very happy. But he was born with a severe heart defect called tetralogy of Fallot. He had holes in his heart. And he wasn't even suspected to survive. First place, he wasn't a wanted baby. He had holes in his heart. He had severe scoliosis. He's from Brooklyn, and he would do his best to run around with all the other kids. His parents came over from Russia. He was first generation American, but his old neighborhood was Irish Catholic kids. And he would run around with them as much as he could. And when he had to stop, he would sit down and breathe until he got his breath back, and then they would go running around with them some more. But he wouldn't have survived very long like that. By the time he was 14, he was really struggling. He could, he had shortness of breath. His heart just wasn't pumping the blood that his body needed. And his sister-in-law, whom he lived with by then, because his father had died in an accident, a bus accident, when he was 14. And then his mother, well, I won't go into that, but she wasn't around either. She had to be institutionalized. And he was living with his older brother and his wife. And Helen, my sister-in-law, she saw an article about a new heart repair called the Blaylock procedure. And you might have heard of that. There was a movie about it. They now call it the Blaylock-Hanlon procedure because the man who had a major role in developing it was Black. And he wasn't given recognition until recently. Go in through his back and partially repair one of the holes in his heart. And that
Mhm.
kept him going until he was about in his early 30s. And by then, he was able to get open heart surgery. He was one of the first recipients of open heart surgery,
Wow.
which makes me think of President Nelson. But
Yes, it
yeah,
does.
and that kept him going.
Amazing.
And he was 40 when I met him. I was 28. He was healthy for a long time, and we really enjoyed our lives. When I met him, he lived in a basement brownstone apartment right in Manhattan. And then we moved to a high rise and we decided we wanted to have a country place. We bought a tiny little cabin out in Pennsylvania and spent weekends there with friends. And we had a lot of fun. Everything was fine. Everything was perfect until when we were in Florida. We were visiting friends in Florida. That's where we got married, on a dock in the Indian River, because it's so easy to get married in Florida. So easy, much easier than most other states. So we got married on a dock in the Indian River, and we were very, very happy to be taking that step. But while we were in Florida, David started having pains in his chest. Just
Mhm.
small, not much, but worrying. So when we got back to New York, and yeah, we were living on Long Island, Eastern Long Island, which most people don't know is very rural and very beautiful. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor thought, well, it's probably a node, that regulates the beats of your heart, a timing thing in your heart. But when they did an angiogram, which by the way was the first time I almost lost him because his heart went down to 20 beats a minute while they were doing the angiogram, and they had to stop. But they got enough film to know he had severe blockages in his heart and he needed a quadruple bypass, but they couldn't do it because that early heart surgery, the back of the breastbone had fused to the sac around the heart, the pericardium. They couldn't crack his chest, it would tear his heart apart.
Oh my
So what they had
gosh.
to do was put in a stent, which was very tricky. The stent that they had to put in was around a bend with a little flap of plaque sticking out. So it could have killed him too, but that worked. And over the years, he got more stents. And every time he started getting short of breath and having more angina pains, he got another stent. And in between, he was fine. He was a graphic designer with his own small firm. And he
Did
was
he have any background in the church or understanding
Oh
of the
no,
church?
no, no, no.
Okay.
He wasn't hostile to religion in general, but he was pretty hostile to nuns and priests because when
Okay.
he was very sick, sometimes he was in a Catholic school or Catholic hospital, and nothing against the Catholics, but at that time, those nuns and priests were extremely strict, overly strict with the children, and
Mhm.
he did not like nuns and priests at all. So after that, after the stents, everything was fine. And over the years, of course, it got worse and worse. And finally, he started going into, and this was over the course of 44 years, you understand. He started going into congestive heart failure, kidney failure, almost ready for dialysis, but not quite. By that time, COVID reared its ugly head and we
Mm.
couldn't go out anywhere. David was a very social person. He loved to socialize, loved to go to parties, and we couldn't do any of that. And he just didn't have anything left. You see this fish behind me there
Mhm.
on the wall? That's one of his first intarsia carvings. He did all sorts of
Wow.
woodwork. He was wonderful at woodwork. And he made all sorts of sculptures from little tiny ones to great big tall ones. And he had
Wow.
a show at a co-op gallery down in Soho in Manhattan. And he was very, very talented. And he was always doing some project or other. And he loved to do yard work. And he just wasn't able to do any of those things anymore. And he was getting so depressed that he would sit in his recliner in our living room and just, I can't do anything. And he was getting so very depressed. And unhappy, and I knew he was ready to go, but he was wanted to stick around for me because he was very protective and he thought I wouldn't get along if he was gone. So we were always big huggers, and one day toward the end, I put my arms around him in the kitchen, and he was so thin by that time that I could get my arms all the way around him. He was just losing weight and getting very, very frail, and he was falling. He was tripping over things, and he wouldn't always tell me because he didn't want to worry me, but he had fallen several times. And that, of course, is a bad sign. But he was 84 years old. We kept having to go to new doctors, this clinic and that clinic, a blood clinic and a pain clinic. And whenever someone found out that he had tetralogy of Fallot and that he was 84 years old, they were just like, what? That's an absolute miracle because you don't live that long with a heart
Right.
defect, that even with repair. But he was 84, and that day in the kitchen, both of us knowing that his time on earth was drawing to an end, I whispered in his ear, I'll be all right when you're gone. I'll miss you every day, but I will be all right. And not long after that, I woke up one morning and David was already in the living room. And then I heard a thump, just a loud thump. And I ran into the living room. He was face down in the hall with his quad cane under his right side. And I knew what had happened instantly. He had gotten up out of his recliner and turned to walk into the hall and tripped over that quad cane. And every time I see an older person using a quad cane, I tell them, look, my husband died because he tripped over one of those. Get a different
Wow.
kind of cane. And they do
Mhm.
have now with smaller, triangular. Of course, I called the ambulance, and because it was COVID, they
Mm.
put him in a stretcher and put him in the back of that ambulance and drove away with him. And I couldn't go. And they called me hours later because when they turned him over, I could see that the whole right side of his face was bruised and bleeding a little bit from where his glasses had hit. He had hit his head really hard. He couldn't stop it because of the quad cane. And so it was his head hitting the floor that I heard that loud thump. And I knew this was going to be the end. But I waited at home until they called me. They had taken him to another hospital, like that had better resources for brain injuries. And when I got there, he was still conscious. They called me and said I could come and see him because they knew he was dying. When I got there, he was still conscious and he was still able to respond to the nurse's commands to raise an arm or raise a leg, but he was semi-conscious. Knew he was on a lot of pain meds, but he wasn't distressed. He seemed almost happy. He was smiling a little. He knew that his time on earth, his time of misery, was coming to an end. And I had assured him that I would be all right and gave him permission to go. So we weren't able to hold a conversation. We weren't able to have a last hug or say, I love you. And then I went out in the hall and called his niece, Susan, lived in Philadelphia, and she hadn't been able to come visit because of COVID. And at this point, she couldn't leave there until Sunday. She had things that she absolutely had to do. So I went back in and said, I spoke to Janet, and she sends her love, and the whole family sends their love. And he smiled a little and said, that's nice. And those are the last words he ever spoke.
Mm.
We got him into a hospice. Um, and I went and sat with him all day on Saturday. And then I got a call early Sunday morning that he had passed. And even though I knew it was coming, he had been going downhill for years. You think you can prepare yourself? You can't.
Mhm.
You can't prepare yourself. And I won't go into all the ways I dealt with my grief, but I was alone and I hadn't anticipated that. I hadn't anticipated him dying from a fall. It was a tender mercy. It was, because he would have been suffering for who knows how long. But then he went on the other side, and I'll tell you something wonderful. Skip ahead after I'd come back to church a couple of years later. I've gotten lots of personal revelations since I came back to the church because I came back like a little child. I had never gotten a true testimony. I had held myself at arm's length from everything, even though I seemed to be, joining in the everything at church. And I really didn't understand it. I didn't get a testimony. I didn't want anybody telling me what to do, and I just went along. I was just going along with the family. I didn't understand it. I didn't have any feeling of the Holy Ghost coming into my heart after I was baptized. I barely remember my baptism. But this is one of many very sweet, tender mercies I got after I came back. I actually had a dream of David and me. He had just published a photography book, and we were looking at the first royalty statement, and suddenly he said, I want to send a Book of Mormon with everybody who buys my book. And that's how it was confirmed to me that he had accepted the gospel. And I have
Oh my gosh.
since then, we did his endowment. We did all of his temple work. My family, my wonderful family, my nieces and nephews and my sisters, we all did his temple work. And after that, I was given to know that he has a Melchizedek priesthood and he's preaching the gospel on the other side,
Wow.
preaching to the spirits in prison. Anyway, that was just wonderful. But going back for a moment, in the weeks after he died, and I was sleeping on his side of the bed, hugging his pajamas, and I dreamed, and I was missing him so much. Just cried myself to sleep every night because he was such a wonderful companion. And suddenly, it was a dream, but it wasn't really a dream. It was real. Suddenly, I realized he was beside me. He was sitting up in bed beside me, and I sat up and I said, "Oh, I miss you so much." And he said, "I know. That's why I came." And then we held each other. And that was a tender mercy. His spirit was really there. And Heavenly Father gave me that to comfort me. I know he did. And it was just so wonderful.
Oh,
Anyway, so we better get ahead to where I actually came back. A year after David died, to comfort myself and distract myself while he was declining, and after he died, I was planning road trips because I loved solo road trips. The first one I took was I was 28, trying to escape from my first marriage. And on one of my trips to New York, I drove. I drove all the way from San Diego to New York City by myself.
wow.
The second night out, I couldn't find a motel. So I actually slept. It was near Golden, Colorado, and I pulled off the road into a little, I think it was a little camping area, but I was the only one there. And I fell asleep listening to a stream. I just slept in the car. I put some sheets up around the windows. So after David died and after COVID lifted, I had actually arranged our little red Ford Escape into a little camper. And I got a cargo van on top and I packed the car and I drove out to Utah. I drove to Santaquin. I wanted to take back roads, but I had two brothers that I grew up with. And Scott, the youngest of the first four children, his partner Nancy was dying of cancer, but he needed my help. And I was the only one who was not in the church. And Scott was very disdainful of the church and of organized religion. He thought he was a Buddhist or something. I don't know. He believed in reincarnation, but he was openly disdainful of my sister's beliefs, religious beliefs and political beliefs. He made fun of them, and that was not nice. But I was not in the church. We had the same political leanings, and so I was the only one he could turn to. He also said I was the one who basically raised him, and I don't remember because my memory of those years is hazy, but it's probably true. Anyway, so I was the only one who could go out and comfort him. So I drove to Santaquin to my sister April's house, and that same day they had brought my sister Lynn, who had been diagnosed with MS, up from San Diego area. And so we got there on the same day as four sisters. My other sister Rita, who's in a different church, evangelistic church, and loves Jesus all to pieces. She's great. She came up too, and we'd never before been together for a long, long time. I got there in the middle of June, and the first anniversary of David's death was June 14th. So all my sisters gathered around me and comforted me, and it was the best. And then I drove out to Santa Rosa, and I'm not going to go into that whole story. It's too much. But long story short, I was there for a week. I went back to Santaquin, then I went back out there and was there for 3 weeks. And so I left, and Nancy died a couple of days later. And then Scott, who had already been diagnosed with anorexia and other problems, a few weeks later, they found him dead in his bed.
Oh my
He
gosh.
he wasn't eating anything, maybe an occasional banana. He was drinking wine and smoking pot all day, and
Mm.
his body just couldn't take it. He just laid down and died. He needed to go home. We're getting prepared to do his endowment as well as our other brother Alan, who also died. So we lost both our brothers within a year and a half. Our younger brothers.
Wow.
That was really hard. But we're preparing to do their temple work, and we know they're both well and happy. I've had communications from Scott. One of the tender mercies I got in the temple, when I sit in the celestial room, sometimes I just close my eyes, and sometimes Heavenly Father gives me a little glimpse through the veil, and those have been so wonderful. And about Alan, I asked this a few days after he passed away in California. He had become homeless again because he wouldn't let anyone but Lynn take care of him. And that's part of what made Lynn so sick. She couldn't do it anymore. But in this little, just a glimpse of a vision across the veil, I saw Alan, still weak, but being helped to stand, held up on either side by our mother and his father, my stepfather, and with other family around. And he's fine. They're both fine. They're
Wow.
both great. Anyway, that's about how I got to Utah. And when I came to Utah and went out to see Scott, I had no inkling that I was going to come back to church. None. I still didn't believe. I didn't believe in doctrines and all that stuff. I thought, I don't need those. I'm a spiritual person. And I was one of those people who said, I'm spiritual, but not religious.
Hmm.
However, after 9/11, I did go back to a church because those planes crashing into those towers, and I was 90 miles away watching on TV. I was working for a newspaper company, and we watched in the conference room the second plane hit the second tower, and my father's plane crashed into the side of a mountain, and that whole confluence sort of sent me into
Yeah.
running for comfort.
Yeah.
And but not back to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I went
Right.
to a Presbyterian church, which we had gone to somewhat as children, went to Sunday school and all that. And I went to a Presbyterian church, and another long story short, I at a certain point after I'd been there a while and I'd been ordained an elder in that church, and I actually felt a strong call to the ministry of the Presbyterian church. It was real. I started going back to school because I quit in the middle of my junior year at BYU and I needed to finish. So I went back to Empire State College, a distance learning university, and I started studying the history of religions, which was very interesting. I loved it. I studied Native American religions and Far Eastern religions and Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and Judaism, and I studied them all, and it was very, very enlightening. But also, I'm going to tell you, there are traps in studying those things because when you study, especially Eastern religions, you learn that there were other stories of dying and rising gods, of virgin births, and gods who came to earth and born of a virgin and died and rose. There were stories like that before Jesus came. And I now know that those were portents, those were types. But then I thought, well, Jesus is just the most compelling of those stories. And it's been around for 2,000 years because those records were somehow preserved. And it didn't make me believe more or less. I took those courses for 3 years. And I was getting ready to go to see what seminary I was going to go to. And in the meantime, I thought, oh, well, I'm going to be a minister, but I don't really believe those things. I just want to serve God's people. And I've come to find out a lot of ministers feel that same way. When they learn all the things that they learn in school and in seminary, they don't believe those things anymore that you're supposed to believe when you say the creed. They don't really literally believe in a virgin birth. They don't literally believe in dying and rising. They just want to serve God's people. The love your neighbor, and they love all those things about Christianity. Some of them don't believe some of the
Mm.
basic tenets you're supposed to believe. And I
Yeah.
found that very interesting. I did not become a Presbyterian minister because when it came time to, I actually visited the Union Theological Seminary with my wonderful pastor, 6 feet tall. She was amazing. And I got the applications and everything was going well. But I assumed, this was dumb, but this was my assumption, that because I was an older woman wanting to go into the ministry, that would be novel enough that I would get some sort of scholarship or grant. It wasn't. A lot of older women want to go into the ministry. I didn't get any financial aid. And the reality of that just hit me in the face like a bucket of cold water because I was going to have to rack up more student debt. Would probably have to move away. By this time, we were living in a little cottage on a tidal creek. It was a magical place. We were living in paradise. I thought, if I do this, not only will I make very little money for the rest of my life, I'll have to move wherever they want to send me. I'll have more student debt, which will take me years and years, maybe decades to pay off. And all of a sudden, this call, it was real. At that point, it just vanished. And I went into a mental and emotional tailspin. I was like, what? What happened? That felt so real to me. I actually heard, the voice in my head saying to do this. what happened? So all these things piled in together, and at the same time, I had a little, what I thought was a group of freckles on my left shoulder. Just a little group of light and dark freckles, and the soprano next to me in the church choir noticed it, and I said, "Well, that's." I looked at all the pictures online. I said, "That can't be melanoma," even though my cousin had recently died of melanoma, and our grandfather who lived in Texas had died of melanoma. I said, "That's just a bunch of freckles, and this is probably divine intervention." I went to the dermatologist for something else. And she looked at that and she said, "I don't like the look of that. I'm going to take a biopsy." It was melanoma. It
Oh
was a
my
very,
God.
very early stage, but with the recent history of my cousin, who was 6 months older than I, dying of melanoma, it sent me into a complete tailspin. So all these things happening within the space of a couple of years. And I went kablooey. I just fell into depression. I did get very depressed. At one point, I remember sitting on the couch and thinking, if I could just, I would never kill myself because I know how death devastates the family. I wouldn't do that to David. I wouldn't do that to anyone in my family. But if I could have just been not existent, if I could have just disappeared as if I had never been born, never existed at all, I would have done it like that. So I had the depression, I had the hypomania, and after that, after I was diagnosed with a not too severe, but a mental illness, I began thinking that everything that had happened in my life that was spiritual in nature had just been a delusion. I began thinking that God was a delusion. I read that book about God being the God delusion, and I thought, well, this may be what happened. Maybe I just wanted him to be there. And that's what I thought before I even went back to church, any church. I thought, well, people invented God to comfort them. And that's what I thought for decades, that God was an invention of people who needed comfort. And Jesus too. I mean, I knew he was a real person, but the way he was elevated to a God, I thought, well, that's, people just need that comfort. I'm a spiritual person, and I have had a lot of spiritual experiences when I was out of the church that made me realize that life is eternal. I knew that. At least I thought I knew it until I was diagnosed with a mental illness and thought, hey, this has all been a delusion. Well, I've just been fooling myself. Then I actually started calling myself an atheist. It wasn't real. It was just my mind wanting something more, and it's not there. Even though I still believe that life was eternal, I didn't believe that that had to be because there's a God. It's just in the natural order of things. We have eternal spirits, and they live on, and it doesn't mean there has to be a heaven or a God. It's just nature. That's what I
Right.
thought for a while. Jumping forward again, but after I came back to Utah, I was never hostile to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As churches go, I thought it was the best one, mainly because of the culture, because it was about love and families. And my two sisters that either stayed in or came back in a short time, really needed that. So I never was hostile to the church. As a matter of fact, when my friends who just had heard the rumors or because of some of the stances of the church, thought it was a horrible church and it was, against, all kinds of different people, I would try to correct their misapprehensions if they said something that was wrong. I said, you know what? I used to be a Mormon and that's not true. It really is
Mm.
a wonderful church. And so I always defended it. I went to church with my sisters. And the first time I went to them in a lovely ward and on the other side of Santa Quin, and the first thing I noticed was all the families sitting together. And I had forgotten about that. All the families sitting together and even teenage boys being affectionate with their parents, putting their arms around their mother. I thought, wow, that's different from the outside world. In the first place, on those old line churches, Becky's, young people almost never come to church. You don't seldom see parents and their teenage kids being affectionate because the teenagers just think they have to rebel. And of course, kids in the church rebel too. But
Mhm.
in this ward, there was a lot of young families, and they were just so lovely and welcoming and affectionate with each other and kind to new people. They didn't know who I was, but they just welcomed me with open arms. And in Relief Society, that was the first one we were in. It was wonderful. Lynn and I moved to our townhouse. We'd moved across Main Street, so we were not only in a different ward, we were in a different stake. And we went to this new ward, and it was even more wonderful because there were a lot of older people like us. There were older ladies, some older widows, and just some older couples, and wonderful, wonderful people. And we just love our ward. But that was the first thing I noticed, the affection of the families. And that really impressed me. And then one day, a little while later, I still had no idea of coming back to church. I didn't plan on it. Then once when Lynn and I were up visiting her daughter who lives in Harriman, Utah, which is about an hour north of where we live, we went to her ward and we were saying the sacrament prayers. I just had this feeling in my heart. And I looked at Lynn and I said, "What do I need to do to take the sacrament? I remember Jesus." And she beamed and she said, "You were baptized." So I took the water. I couldn't take the bread. And that was when the first trickle of living water started trickling back into my heart. And shortly after that, we got an email from the church saying, anybody who's gluten intolerant, you can bring your own gluten-free bread. So I started doing that. And it was when I started taking the full sacrament that cracks really started opening in my heart. And not long after that, I started reading the Book of Mormon, the Pearl of Great Price, the Doctrine and Covenants. I read them all in very short order and started reminding myself of what I had left behind. That was how it started. And then when I really realized that, yes, this is real, this is true, this is what I want. I went to seminary and all that, but it didn't sink in. I looked at the Book of Mormon's history. I believed it was true, but after I left and after I believed I was delusional, I thought it was a fraud. But when I started realizing it was all true, and seeing that my sister, although she had a lot of hard things in her family, her children are going through very difficult times, she was always smiling, almost always smiling. She had this big smile on her face. Why is she smiling? Her life is hard. She has a mess. Our brothers died. Her one son is in an institution for dementia, and her other daughters are having problems, and her grandkids are having problems. Why is she so happy all the time? Well, now I know, because she knows Jesus is going to take care of it all. And there's a very difficult situation going on right now with her son. But she knows that if he passes over, he'll be fine. It'll be wonderful. And we'll all see him and be together again. I mean, you can't get a life better than knowing that. Once I realized that, yes, the church is true, I'm back. I am back all the way. I never had a patriarchal blessing. And I went to my bishop, I want to get my patriarchal blessing. And I had to wait a few weeks for that. It was hard to wait. But at 74, I got my patriarchal blessing and it was amazing. I stopped through the whole thing. I stopped through the whole thing. I mean, I know a lot of the blessings in there are what everybody gets, but it was so new and fresh and amazing to me that it's just, cracked my heart wide open. And I wanted to receive all this living water and all this love coming down from my Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. And wow, it was amazing. And of course, we don't share our patriarchal blessings lightly, but there's one thing in there that is very relevant to my writing this book and coming on this program, and that is, you have the gift of being mighty in writing. Use this gift to spread your love of the Savior and your testimony around the world. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do. So I was prompted to write this book, my memoirs, and a couple of small volumes of poetry, one called Faith and Doubt. I wrote a lot of poems about doubting, because I did for a very, very long time. And I know a lot of people are. So I wrote poems about faith and doubt, and then I wrote a tiny little book of poems about the temple, because through the Spirit, Heavenly Father told me to write those poems. He said the
So
book,
beautiful.
it was gradually telling me to write for him. And I said, what? Well, what should I write? Write essays and outlines for talks. And I gave a talk in sacrament meeting a week before my endowment. But so I was doing that all. And then through other personal revelations, I was told it was going to be a book, prose and poems together, write your memoirs. And I never wanted to do that, but I did it. Meanwhile, in all of this, I wanted to take another road trip about, a few months after I returned to the church. I had gotten a new car, so I took a road trip back east to visit my niece in Philadelphia. Through a bit of disobedience about telling something I wasn't supposed to tell, I lost the Holy Spirit for 3 weeks, and I got it back on the way to Palmyra. And there's a story in the book about how I was told to go to the Sacred Grove the second time. I went to Sacred Grove twice. The second time I met a woman, and I was prompted to tell her my story of coming back to the church after 55 years. And she, with tears in her eyes, she said, my daughter and her family just left the church, and you have given me so much hope. And that's what I was there for. So I'm listening to the
Wow.
Spirit. I'm doing what I think I'm supposed to do, and it's so wonderful. It's so
So
wonderful.
beautiful. I love that so much. It's you just radiate joy and peace at
Oh, I
this
feel it.
point in your life. And it's like you've been through so many things and to be just like such a light and to after everything you've gone through and to be able to be at this point where you're just serving the Lord and just
Oh, I'm
opening your heart to all these spiritual experiences. It's so beautiful.
well, thank you. It feels amazing, amazing.
I love it.
I just want testimony that Heavenly Father and His Son will come into your heart and will direct your life for good if you just let them.
I
Don't
believe
walk
that.
away. Come back.
I love that so much. That is the perfect way to wrap up the episode. Jane, you're amazing. Thank you so much for writing your book and for coming on the podcast and sharing your story. And you are just a beautiful person. So thank you so much.
For you, Ashley. And by the way, the book, I'm not trying to make a profit on the book. It's free to read at prodigalmemoirs.com. If you want to buy an ebook or a print book, you can. There are links there. But if I make any profits on the book, they're going to tithing and they're going straight to the church. I am not going to
I
keep.
love it.
I'm
So
not doing this for
beautiful.
money.
A lot of people have asked us how they can support the podcast, and we have created a Comeback Podcast merch line on our website, www.comebackpodcast.org. All of the money made from the merch goes right back into the podcast. So if you are interested in supporting the podcast and you want to purchase some merch, we would love it. Check it out. Thank you so much for being a supporter of the Comeback Podcast and listening to our episodes. It would mean so much to us if you would like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people be able to find us, and we want to share this message to everyone.